Thanks for joining us today on the Same Page. I'm Tommy Sanders. Today, our book is all about one of America's great cities, really one of the world's great cities, New Orleans, Louisiana. Of course, now, post-Katrina, the future of New Orleans and so many aspects of life there is up in the air. Our book today is Why New Orleans Matters by Tom Piazza, the noted music writer who's a transplanted New Orleans resident. And it is Truth in Advertising. It's his argument of why New Orleans matters. Tom Piazza was in Little Rock a few months ago to sit down and talk with our own Kane Webb at the Arkansas Literary Festival. They had this conversation at Lorenzen Booksellers. Watch it and we'll be back with our discussion among the readers. So stay with us on the Same Page.
We're here at the Arkansas Literary Festival with Tom Piazza, author of Why New Orleans Matters. And if you've never been to New Orleans and you want to know what all the fuss is about, read the book. If you've been there and you miss it and want to know why it should be rebuilt the way it was, read the book. It's a love letter. It's a plea. It's a line in the sand. And it should be required reading for anyone, I think, who is going to have a role in rebuilding that city down there. Thanks for joining us, Tom.
That's a pleasure, Kay.
What was your Katrina experience? Tell us that. Let's go back to August and start there.
Well, in August, I was up in Virginia at a place just north of Lynchburg called Virginia Center for Creative Arts. And I was writing on a novel, which I spend most of my time these days usually writing on a novel. And I was up there, and I was about to come back to New Orleans the Saturday before Katrina hit. And my better half, Mary, is from southeast Missouri, from cotton farming country there. And people who live in farming country pay a lot of attention to the weather. And I'm from the Northeast. We didn't really pay attention to the weather. So she was telling me about the storm that was coming. And my sort of default reaction was, another storm, we're going to evacuate, we'll come back, it's not going to be anything. So I was very blasé about it. Anyway, the morning of that Saturday before the storm, I called her. I said, well, I'm coming on down. She said, actually, no, you're not coming on down. And she was evacuating. But anyway, we ended up in Missouri. So I drove across Tennessee to Malden, Missouri, which is where her mom still lives and where she grew up. And we watched all those horrible events unfold on the television in Malden.
The book is two parts, essentially. The first part talks about the New Orleans we all knew, the culture, the food, the music, everything that made it such a unique place. The second part is post-storm. Now, did that happen after you went down and saw what happened there, or was this something you had planned on doing?
Everything about this, the book was written very quickly. It was written in about 4.5 weeks. So everything about it was, it came very naturally to hand, and in a sense it sort of had to, because there wasn't time to really have a kind of crafty plan about it in that way. You know? Initially, I didn't know that I was going to include a part about returning to New Orleans. I thought it was going to be just a book about what I remembered of New Orleans and a kind of plea for, you know, people to pay attention to that. But going down those 2 weeks after the storm was such a powerful and upsetting and multi-layered experience. I felt that I had to write about that was part. I mean, and also just it makes a contrast in the book between all these images of lushness and community and you know, and then this devastation and this total literal absence of community.
Are you back now?
Yes. Yeah,
for good?
Sure. Well, whatever for good, whatever for good means these days, any place. Yeah, we're back. I mean, we've been living out of a suitcase for about 7 months, but we finally got back, or 6 months, and got back into my apartment, which had a lot of storm damage but no flooding. Got back in there about a month ago. Mary's house, which did flood, won't be ready probably till June, just in time for the next hurricane season.
What is life like in New Orleans right now, 7 months after the storm, roughly?
Well, of course, that depends what neighborhood of New Orleans you're talking about. There are certain parts of New Orleans where if you didn't know any better and if you didn't look too closely, it looks almost normal, like the French Quarter, like the uptown neighborhood where I live. It sort of looks more or less the way it did. Unless you look closely and you say, wasn't there a tree there? Oh yeah, you know, that kind of thing. Then if you move out to areas that did flood, though, in some areas there's a lot of work going on, like Mid-City, certain other places. In some areas, like the lower Ninth Ward, it looks more or less the way it did 5 months ago.
I noticed that. I was down there in February, and it looked as if the storm had hit a week before. It's just remarkable. It's really a tale of two cities, if you think about it. You're a native New Yorker, right? New Orleanian by choice. Tell me a little bit about why you chose to move down there and your first visit there, and what was it about the city that grabbed you?
Well, I'm a jazz fan from a very young age. Jazz and blues and a lot of indigenous American, vernacular American music, rhythm and blues, all that kind of stuff. So if you like that kind of music, New Orleans is just really at the center of your map of the world. And so I always wanted to go there, and I finally did in '87 for the Jazz Festival, Jazz and Heritage Festival. And what was remarkable to me was that the entire city in some way kind of expressed a lot of the values that I found in the music. There's a tremendous sensual dialogue between individual people and their surroundings and the community. The same way you have these individual voices in jazz and the sound of the ensemble, this marvelous balance. New Orleans, it smelled great, it looked great. You had these great old giant shipwreck, you know, wooden houses with kind of collapsing porches and banana trees and oak trees, and it's just an incredibly lush place on every level. Tremendous attention to food, to physicality, to dance, to music. And I just responded to it very, very viscerally.
At some point we're going to start rebuilding. We're still cleaning up down there, it seems like. But in your book, toward the end, you do a good job of describing two approaches to New Orleans. One is the top-down approach. One is the bottom-up approach. Describe those two and why, especially the top-down, scares the heck out of anyone who's been to New Orleans.
Well, you have this unprecedented situation of a city that's really a kind of clean slate in some respects, and you know, certainly the population being sucked out of it for those weeks. And so you have a chance in some ways to reclaim a lot of land, physical and not so physical. And so the demographics of the city have switched tremendously, and it's like a roulette wheel that's going around, and nobody's quite sure what slot the ball's going to fall in. The top-down and bottom-up little schematic that I worked out there in the book, it's nothing very profound. It basically just talking more about a set of assumptions with which you approach all the various questions that are involved in rebuilding. Do you approach it from the standpoint of, let's bring back the people who want to be in New Orleans, all of them, rich and poor, black and white, and try to bring them back to their neighborhoods and make that the fundamental thing that we're going after, and ask, how do we do that? Or, which is what I would call a kind of bottom-up approach, you know, it starts with the people who actually live there. Or do you take a more kind of architect's model-driven idea where, okay, now we have a chance to make the city into a kind of Disneyland version of itself?
So 15, 20 years from now, realistically, what do you hope New Orleans will be? And what do you fear it would be?
Well, what I hope New Orleans will be is a thriving, beautiful, sensual place that is full of the joy of life, and that gives all the evidence of all the extraordinary spiritual resilience and cultural resilience that have drawn people to New Orleans and have kept people in New Orleans, and that makes New Orleans New Orleans. I hope New Orleans it's going to be different the way any place changes over time, but I want to see that life spirit kept there. And I guess if you want to say, what am I afraid of? I'm afraid that, you know, there are a lot of interests that I think would like to see it replaced with a kind of petrified version of itself.
Of a Disneyland.
The profits can be more easily taken. Yeah.
Was the book cathartic to write? Because it was cathartic to read. I've been to New Orleans a lot in my life, and I love the city. And reading it, I thought you did a great job of expressing the way I feel and have failed to put into words. But did it help you?
Thank you. It was cathartic in some ways and corrosive in some other ways. I mean, while I was writing the book in the middle of watching all of this stuff happen and in the middle of tremendous, tremendous uncertainty about what the future of the city was going to be and even of what the facts were of the city, because there was very little real comprehensive information coming out because people couldn't get in. And the news reports were centered in different places. So every chapter that I wrote about the food in New Orleans, or what Mardi Gras is like, or who the Mardi Gras Indians were, or about New Orleans musicians, or clubs that people like, or the parades, every one of those things, I was summoning something that is so close to the center of my heart and to the heart of all New Orleanians, at the same time being aware that they might not be there the next time I went back. So it was very painful to write those beautiful, well, if they were beautiful, but the evocations of beautiful things that I loved. It was cathartic, but it was also extremely painful.
I don't want to spring this on you now, but is there a chance you could read a little bit from the book before we finish up? And while you find a passage
oh, okay. You'd like me? Okay.
You might like, let me ask you this. What's next for Tom Piazza?
Well, what I'm doing right now is writing a new novel, and I'm also assembling a collection of my pieces on music. But the main thing is writing a novel, and that's what claims most of my attention these days, is writing fiction.
Do you see a novel set in New Orleans at some point?
No comment. Let's put it this way. I never even thought I would write a book like Why New Orleans Matters, because I will tell you that New Orleans is one of those places, as you know, of course, from having lived there, where people, you're considered an outsider, you know, if your family went back less than 8 generations, you know.
Yeah.
So I always was intimidated by the prospect of writing anything fictional or non-fictional, really, about New Orleans. This book, it was kind of like being pushed off a cliff and being forced to fly or something. Yeah. But it also made me a little bit less intimidated about the prospect of writing fiction set in New Orleans.
Yeah. Well, there's the myth that New Orleans is this Bourbon Street and, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah down there. It's a very family-centered place. And you mentioned in the book that there are folks who've never really left their neighborhoods in generations, you know, and all of a sudden they were scattered to the winds. It's just, there's a total misperception, I think, about that.
That's right. That's right. Well, maybe I'll read a little something about Mardi Gras, I guess, because we've just gone through it, and actually, I found it to be a very kind of profound experience, actually. If you are lucky again, very lucky, you might end up at some place like Crescent City Steaks. This is at the end of Mardi Gras Day. Out on Broad Street, an old-fashioned steakhouse with an old-fashioned multicolored neon sign from the late 40s, and old-fashioned enclosed wooden booths where you can draw an ancient curtain for privacy, or sit at a table out on the small tiled floor under the bright lights with televisions going in the corner and revelers pouring in, some still in costume, and have some drinks and eat a steak and lyonnaise potatoes and be glad, so glad, that your friends are sitting across the table from you one more time. And all across the city, in living rooms and dining rooms and corner bars, in dives and high-class parlors, in dens and on porches and in bedrooms, in the 9th Ward and the 7th Ward, Mid-City and back of town, Carrollton and the Irish Channel and Broadmoor and the Garden District and Girt Town, the French Quarter and the Bywater and the Faubourg Marigny, everyone is saying the same thing. Thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for one more day. Thank you for this beautiful food. Thank you for this wine cooler that my brother-in-law brought over. Thank you for this bed because I can't stand up. Thank you for passing the potatoes. Thank you for everything. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a beautiful book, and it's a very important book. And thank you for being with us today,
Thanks.
Tom
My
Piazza.
pleasure. Thanks, Ken.
All right, we're back and ready to go with part 2 of our show, On the Same Page, and we're coming to you from the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service, ready to talk to our panelists. And just as New Orleans is a unique city, we have a unique set of panelists here, a little bit different than what we usually do. Usually it's all Arkansas folks, but New Orleans so close that we have a couple of New Orleans natives on our panel as well as an Arkansas person. We'll begin with Deirdre Debose from a Pine Bluff person, as a matter of fact, who has always sort of had a love affair with the city of New Orleans.
I love New Orleans.
So we'll talk about that and what you thought about the book. Linda Caillouet. If you read the Arkansas-Democrat Gazette, you're very familiar with Linda and her Paper Trails column, which is 3 times a week, 4 times a week?
3 times a week.
3 times a week. Linda is a native of New Orleans and hasn't lived there in some years, but many of the accounts of you and your parents who still live there moving now to Arkansas were good reading in there and very touching things right there. And Ted Ludwig, New Orleans native, professional jazz guitarist, and that's in the city of New Orleans and now lives in the city of Little Rock. Ted, who has studied at the University of New Orleans, got his master's degree there and studied under Ellis Marsalis, so a very impressive resume and a lot of experiences, I'm sure, in New Orleans to tell us about. When we look at the book, Why New Orleans Matters, the title, you're expecting, I guess, a sort of an argument to be put forth, why New Orleans should be brought back and what was worth saving about it and what should not be lost. And I'll start with you, Deirdre. Is that what you found the book to be about? And was it successful at advancing that argument?
At first, I thought the book was, it started out more or less like a tour guide, pretty much. It hinted on a lot of things that pertain to, community events, annual events, but as I got into the book, he stressed his points as far as the important things that matter. New Orleans it's almost like a piece of the puzzle. You take New Orleans out of this country, and you're doing us an injustice. There's a piece of history, a culture there there are no words to describe it in my book. I have been trying to find for the last few days the words to describe New Orleans, and there's no one word. Mysterious, lovable. You just can't put it together. It's just unbelievably hard to describe, but New Orleans should be put back together. It's a no-brainer in my book.
All right. Linda, and the author gets into this, and he does, as Deirdre mentioned, start with the sort of his experiences, right. the more, some people might call superficial, what people come from out of town to enjoy about New Orleans, the food, the music, right. the culture, the neighborhoods, the events like Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest, but also he mentioned it's mostly about people of modest means who've built a culture up over 8, 10, 12 generations in some respects. And tell us where you're coming from and how well he addressed those people in this book and talked about the worth of that part of New Orleans, that heart and soul of New Orleans.
I think of New Orleans, I think of it as a crazy quilt from the late 1800s, all the exotic pieces of material, the silks and the velvets all stitched together, because that's what it's all about, all the multicultural fabric that makes it so unique. And the food, the architecture, the music, all of that, it flows through those items. And it comes from the people, and it has to do with the spirit and the soul of the place. And it's just a very unique place.
Do you think the author did a good job of describing that quilt to us, that crazy quilt?
I think he did, especially in his personal experiences. In times when he needed help, when his eyeglasses broke, not to give away the book, but in another section when he needed more help, the people, the interaction he had with individuals, just strangers he met. That's the heart and soul of New Orleans.
New Orleans is a big town. I mean, I think you'd think it's 1 million people probably in the metro area. Is that a pretty good guess?
Right.
And people can be intimidated, and life can be kind of dehumanized in a big town. But it seems to me one of his points is that there's a humanity there, and for all the people you have to look out for, there's many more people who are a little more willing and able to look out for you. Just
exactly.
person to person.
Exactly.
Did he get that part right?
Exactly. They unfold you a warm and welcoming place.
Ted, how far does your family go back in New Orleans?
Oh, wow. At least 6 generations in New Orleans. We've all, my grandfather's side of the family coming from the west side of the city in the river parishes, and also in New Orleans, and my grandmother's side of the family coming from areas like English Turn, the famous English Turn,
the river,
you hear about in history. But they all gathered in New Orleans. New Orleans was our home. I lived there all my life, 31 years. And I really like the way that he wrote this book. I think he really hit the nail on the head with this book. I think as far as the importance of the city and what makes New Orleans, it's all the things he's mentioned. It's the the festivals, it's the food, it's the music, the art, the culture, the historical value, but the common denominator in the whole thing is the people. And that is what makes New Orleans, and that is what makes it special.
Your neighborhood is Arabi? That's
Araby.
Araby. Araby is the neighborhood, and you had to evacuate. You left, you wound up here in Arkansas, and I understand for the foreseeable future you're going to be here in Arkansas.
I'm going to be here, that's right.
Yeah. So you don't think your part of town is ready to start back the way it was again? Will it ever be what it was again?
If our town, I don't think will be ready for years. There's still cars on top of rooftops. There's still boats that are sitting on top of telephone poles. There's a Volkswagen Beetle on one of the streets near mine. It's balanced on top of a chain link fence. How did that happen? I don't even know how the fence is still up, but it's sitting there on top of the chain link fence. So my home got knocked off the foundation. It slid into my yard. I don't know if it'll ever be together. I don't think I'll ever move back to St. Bernard. I love St. Bernard. I have a place dear to my heart for St. Bernard Parish. It's just as part of New Orleans as New Orleans is. I lived actually 5 blocks from the city line. But if I moved back, it would probably be to the western side of the city,
which was spared more
spared.
So than that part of town. When people read this book, and of course, you know, I think that some of this book is written specifically for people who've come to New Orleans for one convention, stuck their head out the door, looked at Bourbon Street, and decided this place is not for me. Who cares? Who cares what happens to New Orleans? Do you think this book's going to have a positive effect if enough people can see it? Deirdre, do you think it's going to have a positive? Is it going to reach out to those people who have this preconceived notion about New Orleans?
I think, you know, most people who think of New Orleans, they think of a quote, quote, unquote, Sin City. And this is not describing Sin City. Of course, you know, the realities of New Orleans that are typical to any large city. They're good and bad in every city. And this book, as Linda spoke, touches on personal experiences. There's no way in the world you can read about walking down the street in the middle of a Mardi Gras parade and somebody handing you a nice cold drink without, you know, wanting to experience that. It's almost like a love that is available to anyone who wants to experience it. If you're walking down the street, everybody that I've encountered in New Orleans is very extremely nice. Of course, you know, you have to look over your shoulders depending on the side of town that you are on and the time of day or night. And but I don't go to New Orleans expecting something bad to happen. I refuse to do that, and maybe I'm gullible on that point. But this book gives you some kind of direction of the values that the people in the city hold. The family values, you know, they are really strong on family values and keeping a sense of togetherness and letting everybody know that they're welcome under any circumstances. You're always welcome. So I think the book really hints on that in a lot of different areas. A couple of points that he made in regards to not knowing or being unsure of being in a certain neighborhood. I think that, and once he got there, he didn't realize that he was supposed to be afraid. I think that, you know, I laughed when I read that. You know, you're not supposed to be afraid. You're supposed to embrace and enjoy the culture and the love that's available, you know, to everyone. So,
were you wanting anything else? There are parts of it he missed? Any glaring oversights in your mind, Linda?
I think he hit about all the high points.
Okay. Well, Ted, in your mind, did you see anything that you were wanting to know more about? Great. I mean, obviously, this guy is a jazz music writer, so
yes,
of course his
Right.
description of the music scene and the history
Right.
thereof, I'm sure you enjoyed that. Or did you?
Oh, yes, I did very much. You know, Ellis Marcellus had mentioned this gentleman to me, Mr. Piazza, and Ellis respects him very much. And I had started reading a few of his books, but I really liked the way that he covered the music in this book. He talked about many of the musicians of the past, and ones that many writers leave out. Guys like Papa Celestin and guys like Joe Oliver, King Oliver, who was a huge impact on Louis Armstrong. And many books don't talk about these guys. Jelly Roll Morton and Kid Ory. And some of these types of musicians. And of course, he brings it into the more modern, like with Dr. John, and of course, Professor Longhair. So I really like what he did with the music part of it.
Let me ask you this, Ted. He makes a good point there when you consider that's the birthplace of jazz, and it's a place where rhythm and blues really got going good. You know, 90% of our popular music in America comes from New Orleans.
That's right.
If we don't have a New Orleans, we don't have that musical community like it was before. What does that mean for us as a society? Is it going to, are we going to lose something important?
Oh, we definitely lose something important. New Orleans has a certain rhythm and soul that you can only be gotten there. I hear musicians who are trying to do a second line feel, but never been in New Orleans, and it doesn't sound the same. You know, and I think music history, if New Orleans would have never been there to begin with, I don't think the music would have gone down the same path. I think American music would be completely different. And he does mention in this book, and he mentions it briefly, but how New Orleans musicians came out of New Orleans and went to Chicago. And that's really how it started, how everything branched out from Chicago, went to New York, and so forth. But for now, I think it would be a huge loss for New Orleans music to die. Many musicians learn it's the greatest place in the world to learn how to play jazz.
I want to ask all of you really quickly, we just have a little time left. At the end of the book, the author, Tom Piazza, has a lot of reservations about how New Orleans might be rebuilt. He was concerned about who at that time was, and still is, the mayor, Ray Nagin. He worried about him taking a sort of a Las Vegas or Atlantic City approach to building the city back up again. That book was written right after, in the October, after all these events transpired in September. Knowing what we know now and what the vision is for the city now, are his worries still valid? I mean, does that seem to be where the leaders are taking the city?
Well, Ray Nagin, when he proposed that, it was just a day or so afterwards, the people responded very vocally. So I think he knows that the people of the city are against.
Didn't go for that.
Any kind of Disneyfication.
Right. I agree with Linda. They've got to put the political, gloves down, and everybody's got to come together and work for a better New Orleans and stop pointing fingers. It's time to get to work.
Tim?
Yeah, I think he mentions it very clearly in chapter 5 what needs to happen to really make New Orleans, to bring it back up to greatness. We have to have children who are educated properly. That's extremely important. If we don't educate our children, nothing can happen, and it's the truth. And I think Mayor Nagin, I think he needs to definitely begin to promote the historical parts of New Orleans, the parts of New Orleans that and not go into the direction of Vegas. That's not what New Orleans is about. The casino there, and Mr. Piazza mentions it, and it's the truth. That casino is not, smoking. It struggles. And
it has from day one, right?
It has from day one.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Well, New Orleans has a lot of work ahead of it, and if you want to know where it was before and what one person's vision of it is, definitely recommend this book, Tom Piazza's Why New Orleans Matters. That's been our book today on the Same Page. Deirdre Debose, Ted Ludwig, Linda Caillouet, thank you so much for coming in here today and reading and talking about what the book's about and your insights as well. Thank you for watching On the Same Page.